Hello, everyone. I'm sorry we're getting started a few minutes late. We had to get the tech set up, but I think we're ready to go. So I'm excited to welcome you to the Public Affairs Conference here at Missouri State and to introduce our plenary speaker for the day, Dr. Charlton McIlwain. Dr. McIlwain got his PhD at the University of Oklahoma, and he now teaches at New York University. He is the author of 4 books, award-winning books that I'll let him show you or talk about later if he wants to. There's numerous awards and recognitions for me to list off. I don't want to take the time to do that today. He is also an expert witness and has testified in courtrooms about issues of race, politics, and social issues. And today he's here to talk to you about those intersections. And so if we would give him a great Missouri State welcome to Dr. Charlton McIlwain.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here with you today, and it's good to be in Springfield, Missouri. Someone asked me before we got started if this was my first time to the state, and I said no. In fact, it's not even my first time to Springfield. In fact, I spent quite a bit of time, well, maybe not quite a bit, but several trips, probably more than or close to 20 years ago, when I was first in college at a small college in Oklahoma City and played basketball, and we came up here several times to play basketball against various teams up here. And so being here actually brings back several fond memories, mostly the memory of being young. But thank you for coming out today, and I also want to thank the Public Affairs Conference hosts and organizers for all the great work that they have done in giving me the royal treatment. I also want to thank my good friend Liz Dudash, who I spent some time with in Oklahoma as a graduate student, and I know that she was key in getting me here with you today. Something that I learned very early about the Public Affairs Conference and more about the Public Affairs staff here is that unlike myself, they plan. That I don't really do. And so it was probably 5 or 6 months ago that they asked me to provide a title for the talk that I was going to give here today. And I did what I was asked. I gave a title, but like usual, I had no real clue what that title meant, and certainly had no idea about what it is I would actually say. So it's good that I was able to do that early on. Number one, I'm a serial procrastinator, but aside from that, it forces me to then think about and think through exactly what it is I mean and what I want to say when we talk about network inclusion and the politics of choice. So my purpose here today is to co-opt you in my endeavor to make some connections, principally to think about how we might connect principles of networks to the concept and practice of social inclusion through the exercise of choice. While we may go many directions in our discussion, if you get nothing else out of what we do here today, I want you to think about inclusive excellence as a verb rather than a noun. I want you to think of inclusion not as something that happens, something one arrives at, discovers, or stumbles upon, or even achieves. I want you to think about inclusive excellence as something that you make happen, something you engineer, determine, and control. I also want you to think of inclusive excellence as the product of affirmative action. Now, when I say affirmative action, I don't mean the public policy, not the controversial policy that has in our day and age become synonymous with terms like quotas, undue advantage, or reverse discrimination. I don't want you to think about inclusive excellence as either a failed policy that is fit for the dustbin of history. Rather, I want you to think about affirmative action in terms of its founding principles, the principle found in John F. Kennedy's 1961 executive order, which charged new committees to consider and recommend additional affirmative steps which should be taken by executive departments and agencies to realize more fully the national policy of non-discrimination. I want you to think about the underlying principle behind Lyndon Johnson's 1965 executive order, which directed government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that our employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so when I talk about affirmative action, I want you to focus on the principle and not so much the policy. Though, as you'll probably see, the framers of affirmative action policy in its original sense really knew and took to heart all of what I will talk to you about here today. But what I want to do then today is to lay on the table for you 4 key principles of social networks, bookended on one side by a story about race and housing choice, and on the other, a story about the world's most popular social network, Facebook. I don't know if any of you students will challenge me on that. Sometimes mine do and say I'm even old and behind about Facebook. You guys still use Facebook? A little bit? Okay. I think it's safe to say that everyone in this room here today is committed to the principle and value of inclusion. But I have to say that in this regard, all of us are not unique in this way. Indeed, most people in the United States ascribe to broad principles of social inclusion: non-discrimination, equal opportunity and access, full participation, and the like. And so using a set of detailed online demographic maps at the New York Times, which they recently developed from data collected by the 2010 census, I decided to test this widespread belief amongst a diverse group of students, undergraduates that I taught in a course of mine several years ago called Race and Media. My students, I'm sure, were not unlike most of you students here today. They had diverse personal identities. They think of themselves as the most inclusive generation, and in many respects, they're right. I like to call them the like generation, so-called digital natives who grew up on Facebook and pride themselves in reaching out and connecting with someone, or a hell of a lot of someones, in fact. I asked this ideal and idealistic group to project their minds forward into the future 10, 15, 20 years to that moment when they were considering buying their first home. My first problem, they pointed out, was the time frame, and they said 5 to 7 years was probably more like it. So I asked them to think about this impending choice and to write down on a piece of paper answers to several specific and detailed questions about what their criteria would be for making this choice. Would race and racial diversity play a factor? How much money do you and your neighbors make, and what kind of home do you see yourself and your neighbors being able to afford? Will your children go to public school or private? And no matter what your choice, how many of your neighbors will make similar decisions? In this picture here up on your right, we see a familiar chart that's used by researchers who study racial preferences in housing choice. And they've been doing this for a number of years, and basically what they ask people to do is to ask about a specific racial group that is different from one's own, and then ask them in which neighborhood would they be more comfortable. So perhaps would I be most comfortable here where Asians make up pretty much the majority of the neighborhood, or here where they make up just a percentage, a smaller percentage here, so on and so forth. And they use this to test people's preferences and choice and comfort level with a particular racial makeup of the neighborhood. And so in essence, this is what I was asking my students to do, along with another set of criteria. Now, I had no idea how this was going to turn out. It was like many things that I do in class, an experiment, one that had the potential to fail miserably, as they sometimes do. But this one actually performed perfectly. And here's what they decided. First, every student said that living in and having their kids grow up in a diverse neighborhood and educational environment was an ideal and a priority. Second, not one student, however, chose to use racial diversity as their primary criteria for making this decision. Third, they thought that they would be making obscene amounts of money, spend a fair amount on their homes, and choose a place where they were certain that home would maintain its value. Fourth, most of them said that as long as there was a great public school in the area, that they would send their kids there, but certainly they and their neighbors would have the means to do otherwise if necessary. Fifth, and finally, as to neighborhood racial composition, many of them said that they'd ideally like to be in a place where people of their own racial or ethnic group made up about 50% of the neighborhood and others 50%. Several of the students even said about 70 to 80% of people that were different from them was the ideal makeup for their neighborhood. Then came that moment that all of us that are professors and teachers like to see, right? We teach always thinking that, of course, every teaching moment is going to be that way, but of course we know it rarely is. Looking for that look on students' faces where we know the wheels are turning, that proverbial light has gone off in their head, that they have that blank stare on their face that says, I'm actually checked in and not checked out. And so I opened up my laptop, I punched in their aggregate choices, and then plotted their choices on the New York Times digital maps. This is the neighborhood that approximated their choice. You may not be able to see this very well, but you might recognize some of the boundaries here. This is Springfield, Missouri, census tracts 39, 26, and 28 together. 96% white, average income between $60,000 and $100,000 a year, median home value of $150,000 a year, and 8 to 22% of kids that go to private school. This was when the moment got good. 23 students with eyes wide open, jaws down to the floor, their minds coming to grips with the choice that they made. Now, the point of this was not that the neighborhood that they chose was all white. The point was that all of them who said they wanted otherwise, nevertheless, found themselves here. The point was that they assumed that merely adopting, believing in principles of inclusion was enough. They assumed that everyone they chose to live among would reflect those same principles, and that because of that, they would find themselves in a place where all of their goals, including those about racial diversity, would be realized. They found that social inclusion, at least in this form, doesn't just happen as a natural expression of our principles, and they were upset about it. 2 of my students, at least the following week, came into class telling me that they immediately went home and called their parents because they were so conflicted about the conclusion that they had arrived at. But I would argue that my students were not unique. Indeed, they merely played out what I believe to be the prevailing attitude of most people in the United States. We believe in social inclusion. We believe in equal opportunity, equal access, full participation, and sometimes we even know what it looks like. But we are so ego-driven that we are deluded into thinking that because we believe it and believe in it, that it will just happen. So the question becomes, how can we reframe and how can we think about inclusive excellence so that we can better see it more clearly as not only a matter of choice, but also as a choice that we must put into action? How can we think differently in a way that may help us match our principles of social inclusion with its practice? I believe that thinking about everyday social networks and thinking about life in terms of social networks can help us do just that. Now, certainly the idea of social networks is not new. It's actually very old, but it is experiencing a kind of renaissance, if you will, in both academic and other professional circles, primarily because of the birth of personal computing, social networking, and mostly the available data, the immense amount of available data about networks and network behavior. So what do we have to gain if we adopt a network frame of mind with respect to social inclusion? What characteristics of networks can help us better view inclusive excellence as actively performing inclusive choices? First, connections form the basis of networks. Network connections initiate relationships. They tie people to each other, associate us with potentially new ideals, link us to new knowledge, and hook us up to sources of inaccessible human and economic resources. Inclusion begins with making a connection, and as we all know, to make a connection requires us to make choices about those we want and should connect to. It also forces us to do something, to identify someone, to seek them out, to search for them, and then make that connection. Even the relatively simple choice to be at a particular place at a particular time is enough to put us on the path to making that connection. But of course, it's not enough to do just that. After we search, once we identify, once we home in on, we have to close the deal. We have to make the connection, initiate a conversation, offer an invitation. And so, like networks, inclusion requires us to actively seek out and form new bonds with others and think about inclusion as an act of connecting with others. And this puts us in the right frame of mind to engineer inclusion. Second, networks not only form from connections, but networks and network thinking emphasize the value of strategic connections. Visualizing a network and understanding the nature of the social ties on which it is based make it possible for us to use network ties for goal-oriented strategic advantage. When we delve into our own and others' networks, we can see much more than simply who's connected to whom. We can identify where power resides. We can determine who exerts influence. We can tell which groups of people are more connected and more closely connected to each other. We can tell who is vulnerable to being cut off from the network. And of course, we can tell who does not belong to the network at all. And so for those of us for whom inclusion is a goal, understanding networks gives us the ability to strategically link people to beneficial networks, and by doing so, provide greater access to power and resources, to expand opportunity and multiply the benefits of association with influential others in new and different domains of social and professional life. But making strategic connections requires even greater effort, because it means we not only give thought to connecting and building relationships with others, but that we actively seek and link others deliberately based on who is being excluded from various networks. It requires that we identify and target not only those we like, those we proverbially want to have a beer with, or those we think we are most like ourselves. It means making strategic choices about who does not have the advantage of our network connections, understanding the ways that their exclusion may be disadvantageous, and visualizing the mutual benefit that might result from connecting the network disadvantaged with those who possess network advantages. And so taking a network approach to inclusion helps us understand the necessity and the opportunity to make strategic choices about those we might target to include in our individual, personal, collective, and institutional networks. Those of you that may be economists or studying political science or something of that nature will be familiar with this idea of game theory, rational choice, goal-oriented behavior. It's a way of looking at the world and understanding behavior and choices based on strategic action. That is, the assumption that our choices have both costs and benefits, and that strategic action helps us to minimize those costs and maximize the benefits or advantage. And so this is what I talk about when I say strategic connections. And so when we talk about inclusive excellence, not just saying we make a connection or making a link with someone else, but that we are thinking strategically about the nature of the connections we make and thinking strategically about how those connections will help us fulfill that goal of making our networks more inclusive. Third, even weak ties build strong networks. From the 1970s through the present, research throughout the social sciences has demonstrated what sociologist Mark Granovetter popularly dubbed the strength of weak ties. Now, it seems logical to think that the strength of our network is directly related to the strength of our bonds with each of those in our networks, right? We've all heard that from the time we were young, that if you want to invest in a relationship, you have to spend time, you have to pay attention, you have to do all these things, that relationships are work. But study after study over nearly 4 decades show that whether we're talking about getting a job, disseminating information, selling a new product, influencing public opinion, or pushing people towards social action, even our connections with acquaintances, friends of friends, casual associates can make inclusion happen more efficiently, more expediently, and more effectively than putting all our time into developing a few core relationships. Now, it's not that weak ties operate at the expense of strong ones. Rather, it means that a range of weak ties in our networks help others capitalize on those strong relationships that we have within our network. The strength of weak ties is crucial for building inclusive networks because weak ties are the principal mechanism through which we provide access. We expand access and distribute network advantages through weak ties. Just a little idea of what I mean here. In the literature about social networks, there's a term often used called triadic closure. And what that simply means is if I have a weak tie here, symbolized by the dotted line, so if this is me, I have a weak tie to this person, a strong tie to this one. The theory of triadic closure says that because of this weak tie and this strong one, the likelihood increases exponentially that this person and this person will soon connect to each other. And that is made possible and facilitated because of both the weak and the strong tie here. What we avoid when we talk about access to networks and making our networks more inclusive and accessible is trying to get away from something like this, called a clique. A clique is simply a structure, a network structure where everyone is connected to everyone else. And so what happens in a clique? I've got job information, I've got information about resources, it comes into the network, and what happens? It stays in the network. Once it's traveled from this person to that one and beyond, it ends, the information dies and goes no further. It's a closed network. And so when we talk about weak ties, we talk more about bridges. The idea of linking strong networks through bridges or weak ties that connect various networks. Fourth, networks magnify influence.
When I first tried Fabergé Organics shampoo with pure wheat germ oil and honey, it was so good I told 2 friends about it, and they told 2 friends, and so on, and so on, and so on. And believe me, there's still nothing like the original Fabergé Organics. It gives me super shine, super body.
And super fresh-smelling hair.
Try it, and you'll tell your friends about it, and they'll tell their friends, and so on, and so on. Be sure and get the original Fabergé Organics shampoo and conditioner with pure wheat germ oil and honey.
Sorry, that was a bit gratuitous. My students always make fun of me because inevitably in class, when I begin searching my mind for an illustration for something I'm trying to get across, those examples never seem to come from anything further than about 1987. I try hard, but it's difficult. But Heather Locklear, who was young once, makes the point adequately for the point I'm trying to get across. And that is simply about this idea that economists and others talk about when they talk about the concept of network effects to describe how we add value and amplify the adoption of products and technologies as new users proliferate throughout our network. I use this term to suggest 2 things about social inclusion. First, if we define network inclusion as deliberately making one's social network accessible to others, and therefore providing access to its advantages, it means we can influence others to align their practice of network inclusion with our own. Second, the more that others in our network imitate our practice of social inclusion, the more its value will increase. This is to say that practicing network inclusion can exponentially replicate inclusive action. My real point here is not to magnify the personal flattery that comes with imitation, but to emphasize that the very fundamental action associated with inclusive networks, that is, making inclusive connections, is a way that we can influence untold others far beyond our personal reach. Making strategic connections that maximize the power and reach of weak ties to give others access to the advantages and opportunities produced and available within them. This is the essence of network inclusion. This is what produces inclusive excellence. Before I conclude, I want to say a word about Facebook and another experiment that I conducted in a class of mine recently called the racial web. I asked students to use an online application that accesses their Facebook friend data and returns a list of their connections and the connections between all of their friends and others within the network. It was an easy exercise, and so they literally clicked on a couple of things, and I would recommend this to all of you that are on Facebook. It's an interesting sort of exercise to do. If you look simply for a little program called NetViz, and you click on it, and you can go through the instructions of helping you visualize your network. I'm not sure if NetViz is a for-profit place, but I hope they'll give me money for plugging this. And so I asked them to download their data, and in a column next to each individual in their network, to list the person's racial and ethnic background. Once they did that, and before they sent their actual data to me to analyze, I asked them to report back to me what the percentages were of the various racial and ethnic groups within their network. And email after email conveyed their numbers to me with a familiar qualification. Professor McIlwain, I'm ashamed to say, Professor McIlwain, I cannot believe, Professor McIlwain, don't judge me, but again, their results bore out a predictable pattern. The majority of students in the class that were white, their networks were almost exclusively white. Asian students in the class, their networks were made up of a majority of whites. The few Latino and black students in the course had networks that consisted of about a quarter to 1/3 of others who were also black and Latino. And then the remainder was all white. And so students here found that even though the opportunity structure afforded them by being at a university like NYU, being in a city like New York City that is very diverse on its surface, they found that by not making conscious, deliberate choices about who was included in their network and who wasn't, that they merely reproduced the status quo. They were uneasy about the idea of either choosing their friends or even making casual connections based on some criteria, being it race or otherwise. They felt uncomfortable acting as if their friendship circles required a rigid racial quota. But the consequence, they found, was a set of networks that was far less diverse and inclusive than they wanted, number one, and number two, than what they thought they had. When they lamented this fact again in class, my response was, of course I won't judge you. I can't. Why? Because you are much the same as everyone else. My point today is simple. What people who study networks have found is that the structure of network formation is fairly predictable. Questions about who connects to whom and why, where power resides, and how influence flows throughout networks are questions that we can readily answer because they operate according to established patterns. We may be uncomfortable with making strategic choices. It may make us uneasy to identify people based on certain characteristics, be they physical, social, economic, or otherwise, and making deliberate decisions based on them. We may even think it is counterproductive to notice difference or distinction or disadvantage, and that's fine. There are plenty of people who feel that way, plenty of good people who feel that way, plenty of people who believe in the ideal of social inclusion who feel that way. But know this, if that is a position we take, we are almost certain to reproduce and replicate the status quo. To reproduce and replicate a society where power and influence and opportunity and access are scarce commodities that are guarded like gated communities by those who reside within its networked walls and those who are shielded from it on the outside. If inclusive excellence is to become more than a principle, if we hope to radically alter the status quo, then we must do things and do them differently. So whether we are individuals, social groups, or individuals of groups working within and representing institutions, if we are not only to make inclusive excellence a goal, but engineer it, then we must act affirmatively. We must decide deliberately, and we must make calculated choices about how to reconfigure our networks in ways that maximize the potential and probability of inclusion. Thank you. They're here.
So if there's any questions that you have for Dr. McIlwain, we're an open forum.
Fire away.
I don't know if you want to say that to him.
Yeah, I like what you said. That was very interesting about cliques. and how the information is kept within the click. Is it as simple, would you say, to break that click up, or not, I wouldn't say break it up, but to distribute that information? Is it as simple as just making more strategic connections, or is there something else that would need to be done for those clicks to be more inclusive?
Thank you. Good question. Of course, nothing is as simple as we sort of think it is, but it may be just as simple, at least, to provide the possibility. The first thing that has to be done is to not necessarily break up the click, but to open up that click. And so we do that by making other ties. And what that means is that we make ties then to people who are not already within the network. That I make further ties, not based on who else I'm meeting on the basis of who else is in my network, but someone who is outside of it. And that simple connection and link, no matter how weak, makes that information and whatever else is flowing through the network accessible to that person. So even that ephemeral tie, someone I meet at a dinner party, exchange a business card with, link them up on LinkedIn or Facebook, or simply put them in my Rolodex, that places them in a position where they're able to access this other information. And so at the very bottom of it, it is as simple as opening up that connection to other weak ties.
Brandy?
I'm curious, in the light of the information that your students found out about their behavior, did their behavior alter in any way?
Can you speak just a little bit louder? I'm having a hard.
Sorry, in light of the information that your students found out about their behavior, did it alter in any way?
The
Their
information
behavior.
about the Facebook
Yeah.
exercise?
Yeah.
I don't know if it altered their behavior much. They were shocked at the finding, right? So what they all thought was, you know, my Facebook friends replicate my actual social network, the people that I'm actually friends with. And that network is very inclusive, very diverse. And so that's what's in their mind, thinking about who they talk to on a daily basis and interact with. But then when they went and actually looked at the data, they were faced with the fact that not only was it not as diverse as they thought, it was almost, for some of them, completely devoid of diversity. And so in their minds, they said, wow, I'm at a place, New York City, where you've got diversity represented in every way, shape, and form. And so all opportunity is there for me to have a diverse network, and I think that I do, and then to find out not really. But then the second thing was they still resisted this sort of idea that making their networks more inclusive and making strategic choices about who they connect with seemed a little not right to them. And so they resisted that, I think. And so it was hard to tell. We didn't really follow up on what happened. My guess is that nothing has changed with their actual networks. But I think much of it was due to this idea that we simply have a problem with, not just them, but others, that making targeted choices like that is somehow offensive, or offensive to our morals or values, even our morals and values about inclusion. And so it's that idea that has to sort of, one has to get over in order to have some actual behavioral change. Anyone else?
It's very interesting. I think the thing I'm wondering about, like in what you were just talking about, and I am on Facebook, at least in my world, I'm not sure that some of the ways that people gain access to, resources, influence, and power, which I think are crucial, really happen on that media. So, I'm wondering, on the one hand, I think it is important to recognize these contradictions, and particularly when you gave the housing example. But is social media like Facebook, and are you privileging that in a way that doesn't account for the value of other kinds of networks? I guess that's what I'm struggling with.
Thank you. Good question. And you're exactly right. Facebook for this experiment was what was expedient to use, but and this was another thing that my students really pointed out. I don't use Facebook to do this other kind of stuff, right? I use it to pass pictures around, make comments about God knows what that has no bearing on anything, and so that particular social network or media is probably not the best scenario to talk about the kinds of inclusive actions, inclusive networks that I'm talking about. And not even social media necessarily being a principal medium, though I think it helps to facilitate it. So if we went over to something different like a LinkedIn, right, that's a little bit more explicit about the nature of the relationships and connectives and the goals of what people do there, we can see this a little bit more fully. Unlike Facebook, LinkedIn is very closed about their data, and so we know very little about it, and very little research has been done about it. But online social networks and offline networks, all of them are what really matter, and some, of course, are different than others. So I wouldn't say that we should privilege necessarily the online versus what happens through, say, a neighborhood network, a professional network, or any of these. I think they're all important, and they all, at least in some way, facilitate some type of greater inclusion, or we can use them for that purpose.
Don't you think that even if Facebook is not maybe used for that sort of purpose, that it's, like you said, an expedient way to create these connections and to create those weak ties that you're talking about that make distribution of information or resources much easier to strengthen the network overall?
Sure, it can do that. It's one of those things that's a kind of tabula rasa, if you will. It bends to what it is we want to use it for. And so there are valuable things to be circulated, exchanged, etc. on Facebook. A large majority of social political action groups have Facebook pages where they communicate with constituents, observers, etc. Many people use that medium to collect resources, donations, money for various causes, and at least there's some sense of a profile and connections that can be made there. And so it can be used for that purpose, even effectively, if one sort of strategically does so. It's a little bit harder, I think, because the nature of the Facebook seems to be much more casual, right? And the making of connections is very easy. The cost is very not intensive. We click a button and we like something, we accept someone's friend request, whether or not we know them or not, or what have you. And so it certainly can be that tool. I just think it's probably less used as that for that purpose than maybe some other social networks. But, people with resources, with access, with valuable things to say, find themselves there. And often what people do is to make a connection perhaps on a Facebook and then follow that person throughout other media, connecting on LinkedIn, connecting face-to-face, finding out what professional organization this person belongs to and making a connection there. And so connection in one medium facilitating connections through others and therefore solidifying some of these links.
I'm going to switch gears just a little bit
'Kay.
outside of Facebook. My question is, in our primary grades or as educators of the younger kids and or as parents, are there any skills or maybe ideas that we can instill in them as children that will encourage them to make those strategic network decisions as they grow, so that it's not something that they're, like with your students, introduced to and it's something that shocks them, but something that they're actually grown up with? Evening, like for me, I grew up in a very white community, and so we're not exposed to, but I feel like our kids still need those skills to be able to form those strategic networks. So I don't know if there's anything that you would suggest that we address from that perspective.
That's a great question, and I think it's probably most difficult at this level of thinking about children. You know, I've got a 4-year-old, and I think about these things, and I live in a community where many of these questions come up, and so they're very sort of palatable for me about how do I want to make sure my kid ends up with a diverse social circle and access to the things that he needs, may benefit from, may have value in as he grows up. And I think I'm not so sure I have sort of a list of skills necessarily, but I think that somehow we have to figure out a way to instill in them the idea that making strategic connections is not bad, is not wrong. So to think about not only, here's a person I like, and I want to hang out with them. I like their family, I like their mom, their dad, but to somehow ask them and have them thinking about, well, why do I like this person, right? We like to hang out and play in the playground, but if we can think about something a little bit more forward-looking, what do I actually derive? What pleasure, what kind of benefits do I get from being with Johnny or Susie or whoever that might be? And to have them thinking about what those choices about friendships may mean beyond simply what I like, what I want to do, and those types of sort of baseline choices. And so I guess what I'm saying is really the idea of, if I bring it back to race, and of course it doesn't always revolve around race, we could say this about any other kind of attribute about diversity. Combating this notion of colorblindness, to say that you should just go out in the world and not see, not recognize, not take into account anything that makes anyone else different from you. I think that's the hurdle that we have to get over, because I think for many, many years we've had it sort of pushed on us that is the ideal. I remember in college I went on a trip to Panama City Beach and I bought a shirt you might remember from the early 90s, or say it says, "Love sees no color," or something like that. And so I think we have to challenge that notion of whether this is our ideal. Do we not want to see people in terms of their particular attributes, their social position, or what have you? And I think we have to say that that is okay, and that is in some ways even necessary if we're going to make inclusion happen, because what we do know is if we say none of that matters, I'm not going to target, I'm not going to see someone's disability, disadvantage, their social individual attribute, then we replicate the same thing we have now, which we usually say is not what we want.
We probably have time for one more quick question if anyone would like to get one in. Okay, well, I want to thank you for coming out today. And aside from all those connections that you see up there for Dr. McIlwain, he is also the co-founder for the Project in Race and Political Communication. I got it right, didn't I?
Got it.
And you can find that on Facebook if you'd like, and connect with them there as well, where you could get some of this information. They put it out periodically, especially during the election season. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. McIlwain.
Thank you.